Okay. Thank you, Alicia, for such a generous introduction. It is such a tremendous pleasure for me to be here today. I am absolutely thrilled to be a part of the Chicago Humanities Festival. This is a festival that I have gone to many times and enjoyed very deeply as a graduate student while I was here. And it's very poignant and very moving for me to be here today, knowing that I wrote this book just across the Midway at the Regenstein Library as a dissertation, and I did it with the help of many people who are in the audience, and their support means so much to me. And I'm really thrilled to have such a wonderful audience, and I want to thank each and every one of you for coming out to hear this presentation. It really means so much when you put your heart and soul into a book and you put it out into the world and you don't know how people are going to receive it. And it's very moving when people are interested in it and have questions about it. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your comments and your questions after I give my talk. So thank you so much for coming today. Let me begin with the inspiration behind this project. So this project was inspired by a story that my aunt told me about a distant cousin of ours who grew up not so far away from where we are right now on the south side of Chicago in the 1930s. And this story begins with a parade, the historic Bud Billiken Parade, an annual parade that, as many of you know, continues to this day. And I'm sure that there are probably many of you in the audience who have been to the parade. On a sizzling summer morning in August, my cousin leapt from her bed to find the best spot to view the parade. She joined a crowd that numbered in the thousands, and she cheered as drum majors, baton twirlers, and celebrities in convertibles passed by. She ran out to the floats to touch the parade's anointed king and queen and caught the candy that the participants tossed to her. The parade was a South Side institution, and at a time when racial tensions ran high, when Black families squeezed into overcrowded kitchenettes, and when Black children knew not to venture beyond the boundaries of their neighborhood, the Bud Billiken Parade evoked a deep sense of race pride, community, and togetherness. For one day a year, Black children could imagine that the city of Chicago was all theirs. Our cousin could not have known that this would be her last time hearing the marching bands and the cheering crowds. Unlike many Black parents, she would not share this experience with her children. She was Black, but she was very light-skinned. In fact, she looked white. And at the insistence of her mother, after she graduated from high school, she would move far away from Chicago's South Side to Los Angeles to live the rest of her life as a white woman. It was not her choice. She pleaded with her mother. She did not want to leave her family, her friends, and the only life that she had ever known. But her mother was determined, and the matter was decided. Years later, after she had married a white man and raised white children who knew nothing of her past, she received a very inconvenient telephone call. It was her mother, and she was calling to tell her that her father was dying and that she must come home immediately. Despite these dire circumstances, she would never return to Chicago's South Side. The young girl who had once sat on a curb in Chicago's most historic Black neighborhood to watch America's largest Black parade was a white woman now, and there was simply no turning back. After my aunt told me this story, it stuck with me. it wouldn't leave me alone. So I spent the last 13 years wrestling with this curious phenomenon of passing. Conventional wisdom tells us that a history of passing cannot be written, that those who passed left no trace in the historical record, and that only novelists, playwrights, and poets could write about this clandestine and hidden practice. But I believed that there were sources out there for historians, just waiting to be discovered. So I went into the archives looking for ghosts, hoping to tell their stories. To find these ghosts, historians must seek out unconventional stories that vary at different historical moments. In each era, Americans produced new sets of unexpected sources, from runaway slave advertisements to diary entries, from newspaper accounts to laws designed to preserve racial integrity and police the one-drop rule, from students' records at colleges and universities to articles in popular magazines. The sources on passing are actually abundant, but often found in unlikely places. These sources make plain that passing was generally an egalitarian practice. Elites tended to have greater access to resources and opportunities to pass, but given the right circumstances, the poor could cross over too. Men tended to enjoy greater mobility in American society, but under particular conditions, women passed almost effortlessly. These sources revealed passing to be a deeply individualistic practice, but also a fundamentally social act with enormous social consequences. The iconic image of the heartbroken yet sympathetic Black mother who must not speak a word nor lay eyes upon her white-looking child in public lays bare the painful consequences of this practice. A history of passing cannot be written without telling her story too. Passing was often an intentionally or involuntarily collaborative endeavor. Family members, friends, and neighbors and coworkers were often affected by and sometimes implicated in this practice. Those who were left behind described the pain and the loss of this act just as keenly as those who passed. To pass as white meant to lose a sense of embeddedness in a community. For many family members and friends of those who passed, racial identity came to mean much more than an individual's rejection of the race. It meant no longer belonging as a family member and no longer sharing experiences, stories, or memories of times past. Passing is often presented as a story of gain. By passing as white, particularly during the years of legalized segregation, one could access a range of employment opportunities that would otherwise be restricted. One could live in a better neighborhood. One could enjoy countless social privileges, like sitting in a more comfortable seat on a train or being addressed as Mr. or Mrs., respectful titles that were reserved for white men and women only. But my cousin's story made me realize that to write a history of passing is to write a history of loss. The goal of my work is to explore not only what was gained by passing as white, but also what was lost by walking away from a Black identity. Racial passing is an exile, sometimes chosen, sometimes not. From the late 18th century to the present, racially ambiguous men and women have wrestled with complex questions about the conditions of their times, and they have fashioned complex understandings about their places in the world. Over these 2 centuries, countless African Americans passed as white, leaving behind families, friends, communities, and roots. Lives were lost only to be remembered in family stories like mine. My book is an effort to recover those lives. I join scholars who have argued that race is socially constructed and performative, but I keep my eye on what race and racial identity mean to those who are racialized. Rather than seeing racial identity from the racial regime looking down on those who passed as white, I bring into focus what passers saw when they looked out onto their own worlds. Race was quite real to those who lived with it, not because of skin color or essentialist notions about biology, but because it was social and experiential, because it involved one's closest relationships and one's most intimate communities. Let me take a step back now and offer a broader historical context to this project. Racial passing in the United States is the focus of my project, but it must be acknowledged as only a subset of a much larger phenomenon that encompasses multiple disguises and forms of dissemblance. In the 19th century, as young men and women steadily migrated out of small towns to seek their fortunes in America's booming cities, American Victorians warned that these men and women might pass and enter higher social classes to which they did not belong, given the social fluidity of early 19th century America. While American Victorians were fretting over class passing, Jewish applicants changed their names to outmaneuver discriminatory admissions policies that limited enrollments at universities such as Harvard, Princeton, and Yale. Chinese immigrants disguised themselves to pass as Mexican and to enter the U.S. from the U.S.-Mexico border during the era of Chinese exclusion. In 1907, a U.S. government investigation discovered these photographs attached to fraudulent Mexican citizenship papers. Loretta Vasquez, a Cuban-born woman, passed as a Confederate soldier to fight in the Civil War and entered the ranks of numerous women who joined the military or participated in occupations and activities restricted to men. Gay men passed as straight, which was also known as, quote, putting their hair up. Married women and worked in professions that would have been unavailable to them if they had, quote, let their hair down. And Mez Mesro, the flamboyant jazz saxophonist born to Russian Jewish immigrants, passed as black to shore up his musical credentials. Here I have identified only a handful of examples of a sweeping phenomenon to demonstrate its flexibility and its adaptability to various historical contexts. The poor passed as the rich, women passed as men, Jews passed as Gentiles, gay men and women passed as straight, and whites sometimes passed as black. And of course, the reverse of each of these dyads was plausible given specific conditions and circumstances. Particularly in societies with relatively open and fluid social orders, the permutations on passing were endless. Now, let me give you a brief overview of my book, which spans the late 18th to the mid-20th centuries. The lived experience of passing, the act of negotiating the permeable border between black and white, reveals one way that everyday people have interacted with a racist society since the late 18th century. Each era determined not only how racially ambiguous men and women lived, but also what they lost. In the antebellum period, enslaved men and women lived with a looming threat of loss, knowing that they could be bought, sold, and forever separated from their families if their master lost a card game or decided to present a slave as a wedding gift. During the era of slavery, to pass as white was to escape, not necessarily from blackness, but from slavery, often with the intention of recovering precious relationships and living as black under the more secure conditions of freedom. Passing as white became possible in a society where whiteness was not based solely on appearance, but also on dress, behavior, and mannerisms. Indeed, skin color and physical appearance were usually the least reliable factors. Racially ambiguous slaves drew on highly sophisticated understandings of racial, gender, and social norms to enact whiteness, and by doing so, many successfully passed to freedom. This is one of my favorite stories. Ellen Craft passed as a white man, crossing both racial and gender lines to escape to freedom, while her darker-skinned husband played the role of her slave. It was necessary for Ellen to pass as a man because she knew it was highly unconventional for a white woman to travel alone with a male slave. But the Crafts' convincing performance required far more than Ellen's white skin. It was Ellen's knowledge of how to dress and comport herself like a Southern gentleman, and her subtle and nuanced understandings of Southern social and gender norms that made this daring undertaking a marvelous success. Concerned that her beardless face might betray her, or that her illiteracy would prevent her from registering her name at hotels, Ellen became a master of improvisation. She bound her right hand in a sling so that she could ask others to sign her name for her. She bandaged her face so that no one would know that she did not have a beard. By feigning illness, disability, and even deafness, Ellen politely excused herself from conversation and won the sympathy of other travelers. And in fact, Ellen played the role of a Southern gentleman so well that white Southern ladies reportedly swooned in her presence. Passing to freedom, however, was not nearly as laden with the moral questions and experiences with loss that would follow in later years. During the long years of Jim Crow, passing meant striking out on one's own and leaving behind a family and a people. Without a doubt, benefits accrued to these new white identities. But a more complete understanding of this practice requires a reckoning with the loss, alienation, and isolation that accompanied and often outweighed its rewards. During the Jim Crow era, the period between 1890 and 1955, roughly, segregated living and working arrangements created the necessary conditions for passing to flourish, but also for this practice to undermine Black families and Black communities. This period also witnessed the Great Migration, the massive and unprecedented migrations of African Americans out of the South. These migrations allowed racially ambiguous people to travel and to try on new identities in the anonymity of northern cities. One woman described her grandmother's journey from Mississippi to Chicago. Once in Chicago and no longer immediately identifiable as Lula's daughter, her grandmother could easily enter the white world. When she presented herself for work in Chicago's all-white retail district, no one ever asked if she was Black. The question was unthinkable. Unwritten codes of racial decorum in the fine establishment where she worked prevented such scrutiny. This was one of the most common forms of passing during the Jim Crow era, working white while living Black. 9-to-5 passing, as it was often called, which allowed nearly white men and women to access employment slated for whites only. Simply mentioning that a family member held a white-collar job became a shorthand for passing as white, given the strict segregation of employment opportunities. A woman wrote of a relative who was, quote, working up in New York State, passing as a head manager of the largest paper factory in the country. Family members signaled that a relative had a high-paying job by stating that he or she works as white. And it could be assumed that a relative was passing if he or she worked in a particular field or in an all-white establishment. Henry Park was the only colored fireman in New Haven, one family member bragged, adding, he neglected to tell them that he was Negro. Others conceded, I never tried to pass. Folks thought I was white, and I didn't enlighten them. The constructed nature of race becomes evident when individuals changed their racial identity by changing location, clothing, speech, and life story, thus seemingly making themselves white. Others passed temporarily or situationally to seek respite from Jim Crow living every now and then. In a 1932 letter to Carl Van Vechten, novelist Nella Larson passed while in the company of Grace Nail Johnson, James Weldon Johnson's light-skinned wife. And I'll just read this letter to you. So Larson writes, you will be amused that I, who have never tried this much-discussed passing stunt, have waited until I reached the Deep South to put it over. Grace Johnson and I drove about 50 miles south of here the other day and then walked to the best restaurant in a rather conservative town called Murfreesboro and demanded lunch and got it, plus all the service in the world and an invitation to return. Everybody here seems to think that quite a stunt. Larson's letter reveals the type of momentary passing that became commonplace during the Jim Crow era, but it also reveals the fun and the theatrics of passing. Convincing performances required gumption, resourcefulness, and no small measure of humor. The sheer joy of getting over and fooling our white folks, as Langston Hughes put it, made passing a means of poking fun at a racial system laden with absurdities about racial purity. Walter White, the racially ambiguous executive secretary of the NAACP, made a practice of putting his blonde hair and blue eyes to use to enter the South during the 1920s to investigate lynching. White must have laughed nervously when he sat next to a white man on a train who bragged that he had special expertise in identifying blacks who passed as white. Taking White's hand into his own and pointing at White's cuticles, the white man explained that if White had black blood, it would show on his fingernails, which was a kind of antiquated belief about a telltale sign of black racial identity. In a country obsessed with racial distinctions, passing demonstrated just how unreliable one's appearance was in determining their race. At times, passing was a practical joke at the expense of whites. But this levity must not obscure the work that passing does on more intimate registers, laying bare the high emotional stakes, the threats to family coherence, and the personal dislocations that this practice necessitated. In a memoir of her mother, Ronnie Hartfield, a mixed-race woman, reflected on the expansive sense of black family feeling and wrote that it is said that colored people all over the world will ask each other upon first meeting, "Who are your people?" This question signals the importance of locating Black individuals within larger familial networks and sets of kinfolk. Hartfield's mother had lived on both sides of the color line. In Chicago, she held a well-paying job at the Automatic Electric Company. She did not volunteer any information about her racial background, and none of her coworkers, recent immigrants from Italy, Lithuania, and Poland, asked any questions. As her daughter explained, this was the kind of tacit passing that allowed her mother to gain a foothold in Chicago in the 19-teens. Despite her mother's practice of 9-to-5 passing, she could not make sense of the family dislocations that passing permanently required. As she explained, quote, "In slavery days, people got cut off from their families, but then there was nothing they could do about it. But these passing people who choose to do that, I can't make any sense out of that at all. All they get in return for giving up everything is people can think they're white. People think I'm white anyway, and I don't feel any different. I have my family and my true history. That means something." Shepard's family relationships and her true history were more meaningful than the privileges of looking white. Passing meant letting go of one's people, or as Shepard lamented, of giving up any thoughts of ever seeing one's colored family again, something she could never conceive of. As she asked, how would anybody know who they were without their people? To Shepard's mind, letting go of one's people was nothing less than letting go of oneself. Let me conclude with one of the most heartbreaking stories that I found in the archives. This is the story of Elsie Roxborough, who was born to a legendary African-American family. And she chose to pass as white after she graduated from the University of Michigan in 1937. Her story ends in tragedy. She would take her own life in 1949. During the Depression, the Roxborough family lived a life that few Americans, Black or white, could imagine. They had maids and chauffeurs. Elsie rode horses and drove her father's cars. The family vacationed with other Black elites at Idlewild, a lakefront resort in western Michigan nicknamed the Black Eden. As one family friend explained, "We knew things were bad, but not for our crowd. We knew that there were people out there who were selling apples on street corners, but we wore white linen jackets to Sunday school." Elsie was tall and slender, glamorous and vivacious, with beauty and charm that few men could resist. Langston Hughes admired her. Her classmate, the future playwright Arthur Miller, called her a beauty, the classiest girl in Ann Arbor. Langston Hughes wrote that Elsie would tell him her dreams and wonder whether or not it would be better for her to pass as white to achieve them. After graduating from college, Elsie moved to California and passed to work as a model and a screenwriter. When her fortunes ran dry out west, Elsie moved east. In New York, she dyed her brown hair red and dropped the famous Roxborough name to become the unattached white Mona Manet. But even as a white woman, her dreams would never come true. And this is a picture of her when she was passing as white. Langston Hughes was in Spain when Elsie wrote him to tell him that she had decided to pass. For several years, Elsie wrote letters to Hughes and sent him gifts at Christmas without a return address on the package. In time, Elsie's letters and gifts stopped altogether, and Hughes never heard from her again. When Elsie's white roommate returned from a weekend trip, she found Elsie in her bed. It appeared that Elsie had committed suicide. her sister, who could also pass as white, traveled to New York with the wrenching assignment of claiming the body. The arrival of this ostensibly white sister allowed Elsie to remain white even in death. Elsie had ridden her father for financial help. He refused her, and 3 days later, she was dead. Her sister would never speak to her father again. By the 1940s and through the 1960s, personal testimonies began to declare that the losses of passing were simply too much to bear, and it was time to give up and come home. The Black press published numerous testimonials of African Americans who disavowed passing and cataloged the countless psychological advantages of embracing a Black identity. Many articles cheerfully announced the collapse of the economic barriers after World War II that seemed to make 9-to-5 passing no longer necessary. Other essays focused on the collective pride that African Americans experienced and the growing protest spirit of the burgeoning civil rights movement. The Johnston family, shown here in their suburban home in Keene, New Hampshire, passed for 20 years before they were discovered. The father, a successful and well-respected radiologist, applied to be an officer in the Navy during World War II. A naval background check revealed that he had been in a Black fraternity during college. Now, note to self, if you're planning to pass as white, best not to join a Black fraternity in college. But he did. So it was this that led to this discovery that the family was passing. So after the family's secret was revealed, they insisted that they were through with passing and that they would never pass again. By the 1960s, racial politics had changed once again. Black identities were affirmed and passing was rejected. Black was beautiful. Blending in with the white world seemed no longer economically necessary, politically advantageous, or socially desirable. I am often asked, do people still pass today? And after the Rachel Dolezal affair, we know that, in fact, they do. So I am certain that passing continues, but probably in very different forms than what I have described in this talk. We now live in a far more multiracial society than Ellen Craft or Elsie Roxborough could have ever imagined. The conditions of the 21st century allow for a greater acceptance of mixed-race identities, but still the core issues of race and identity remain. Each generation must navigate the social currents and racial realities of their time period. A history of passing opens a window on the complexity of the human experience. It allows us to gain a deeper and more meaningful understanding of the ways that race is lived and experienced. I have assembled a disparate cast of characters, scenes and settings, and moments of conflict and contradiction to knit together the history of passing. Passing offered countless freedoms, from the pleasures of sitting in more comfortable sections of movie theaters to the simple dignities of trying on a hat without being compelled to buy it, to the more elusive opportunities to feel like a man or to be treated like a lady. Passing is an enduring historical phenomenon that opens a wide window onto larger issues about fluid racial definitions, the changing dynamics of race relations, and the complex and circuitous routes along which African American identity has developed in the United States. My book attempts to reconstruct the world of passing by pairing the scholarly discussions of its social, economic, and political contexts with the personal, emotional, and family materials that make it human. Passing was not an automatic response to racial discrimination. Some African Americans used passing as a crucial channel, leading to physical and personal freedom. They declared their rights as American citizens and insisted on their humanity. What they could not fully know until they had successfully passed was that the light of freedom was often overshadowed by the darkness of loss. Thank you very much.
At this moment, we'll have about 15 minutes of Q&A, so if you'd like to raise your hand, I'll be coming around with the microphone.
Thank you. I'm very eager to hear questions and comments.
Thank you for coming and for sharing these wonderful stories with us.
Thank you.
I was only familiar with Walter White
Yes.
because he did such a successful job of documenting lynchings and Klan meetings. And so he did so often for our greater good and for our gain, not just for himself, but for society as a whole. I'm wondering if during the time that you studied, if there were laws passed against passing for white, and if there were individuals who had to face the law and were charged with such a thing. Thank you.
That's a great question. It's very interesting because there weren't actual laws, I would say, but there was a lot of anxiety and a lot of concern about passing for white. So there's one story that's very interesting that I found in the archives about a man named Walter Plecker, and he was a eugenicist. He was very concerned about immigration, and he was also very concerned about passing. And essentially, he was one of the architects of a law that was passed in 1924 in Virginia, which was called the Act to Preserve Racial Integrity. And basically, Plecker was very aware that there had been a long history of racial mixture in our country, and he was very worried that some of the products of this mixture would pass. So he was the one who really designed and really kind of pushed forward the one-drop rule. And so what he would do is he would investigate people who he believed had some Black ancestry or even Native American ancestry. And he was particularly worried about both groups, both Native Americans who were passing as white and Blacks who were passing as white. And he became obsessed with this concern about passing. And it got to the point where he would actually write letters to the superintendents of cemeteries to tell them that they had buried someone in a white cemetery who had Black blood. And he would say, aren't you concerned that when the white mourners come to pay their respects to their lost loved one, that they're going to feel very uncomfortable when they have to mourn and grieve next to a Black family? He would also get students ejected from schools who were attending white schools. So he was very, very obsessed with this issue. And then he was also very worried because he felt that even though he had some control over the laws in Virginia, that he didn't have any control over the laws that he believed were much more lenient in North Carolina, which could disrupt everything because someone from North Carolina who was passing as white could move to Virginia. So he was very, very worried about all of these issues. And one thing that was also quite interesting in Virginia was that given the history of Pocahontas, there were a lot of very prestigious families who trace their heritage back to Pocahontas. So in the Act to Preserve Racial Integrity, Walter Plecker had to include a Pocahontas exception so that if you could trace your ancestry back to Pocahontas, you could still consider yourself white, because there were so many people who did believe themselves and consider themselves white, but who wanted to sort of honor this heritage. So it's a really good question, and I think that it definitely points to the kinds of anxieties and concerns that that were circulating about passing, particularly during the 1920s when there was also a lot of concern about immigration. So this is also the period where the United States passes its most strict immigration restriction laws as well.
We'll take our next question down here.
Thinking about the issue of family loss, for those that passed, what about having children and that uncertainty?
Right. Great question. So for many people who passed, often for women, they might choose not to have children because there was such a fear about having a, quote, dark baby. And so the family that I showed last, the Johnston family, there was a film that was made about them. It's a kind of quasi-documentary film. And in the film, the wife discusses her concern about, oh gosh, I hope that the baby is white, because otherwise, this is going to be very awkward and uncomfortable. There's also a really interesting passage in the novel The Human Stain by Philip Roth, where it's the husband, Coleman Silk, who's passing as white, and he's fallen in love with a woman who has very curly and very dark hair. And at one point he says that he wasn't sure if he fell in love with her because he loved her, or if he knew that if they did have a dark baby, he could always say that it was because of her coloring. So this comes up a lot. There's a lot of anxiety about a dark baby, and there certainly were cases where somebody was passing and that the baby was born and that the baby was, did not look white, and then the physician is in this awkward position of saying, well, I can't really put white on the birth certificate because this baby doesn't look white. And that often led to marriages that were annulled, or that, where there was a divorce, because particularly before the Loving decision in 1967, interracial marriage was illegal. So if somebody was Black, that marriage was not legal. So that's also a really, really good question, and certainly there was a lot of concern and anxiety about that. But I think it was much more of a concern for women than for men, because I think men felt that they could always say, "Oh, this isn't my baby. I don't know how this happened, but this isn't my baby."
Our next question.
Congratulations on your book and
you.
presentation. I believe I saw you on C-SPAN as well, if I'm not mistaken.
Thanks.
Okay. But anyway, my question is, you said that it was kind of surprising, if I'm not mistaken, that your the documentation that you could find to prove whether someone was passing or not.
Right.
There are a lot of rumors about presidents, and there are rumors about Hollywood starlets, especially maybe, I'm thinking around the 30s or so.
Yeah.
Do you know of any of those who have passed, and will that maybe the subject of a later book?
That's a great question. It's so interesting, and it really makes sense because, we have to remember, we have such a mixed culture. There has been racial mixture. There's whenever two groups meet, there's mixture. That's as polite as I can express it. Sometimes that mixture is consensual, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's rape. And of course we know, given the long history of slavery in our culture, that there was, that rape was very much a major and tragic part of the history of slavery. So it shouldn't really surprise us that there are many people who identify as white, but who have Black ancestry. And what's interesting about this is that it almost seems that in the 19th century, people understood this better and accepted it more so. So there's an interesting case where there's a judge, Judge William Harper, in the 1820s, and he basically says, let's not draw the lines too strictly around racial categories, because there's going to be a lot of people who identify as white, and if we start making these categories too strict, then they're going to find out that they have Black ancestry, and that's going to be pretty upsetting to them. So there's a really interesting case of William Henry Harrison, who, one of our presidents, I'm sorry, that's not right. Harding, William Harding. Warren Harding, gosh, thank you. I'm like needing to phone a friend on this president's name. And it's partially because I love this story so much that I'm wanting to get to the kind of punchline of this. So Warren Harding, thank you, was dogged by these rumors that he was Black, and he never denied it. So during the election, there was all of this discussion, oh, he's Black, and he never denied it. And then at one point, he actually said, if one of my relatives jumped the fence, how would I know? So he basically says, it's very possible that I have a black ancestry. There's also been a lot of rumors that Dinah Shore was Black and was passing as white. So I think that there are probably many more people than we know who passed.
Next question.
Yeah.
I'm the daughter of Day Shepherd, who you referenced in your thing.
Oh, yeah.
The thing that I want to ask is, she was really concerned that there's so much more literature about the tragic mulattoes than there is literature about people who have 9 to 5 passing or whatever and lead perfectly normal lives that are not schizophrenic. So I'm wondering if you found that to be so in some of your research.
Right. So are you Ronnie? Oh, you're Ronnie's sister. Wonderful. Well, I met your sister, Ronnie, when she was finishing her book, and she was such an inspiration, and the book is beautiful. The memoir is really lovely. So I'm a little starstruck, so I just want to make sure I got the question right. Oh, no. So you're asking why there's more literature about the tragic mulatto?
Those who lead perfectly normal lives and accept the
Right.
fact that they're doing it as a convenience.
Okay. So the question is, why has American culture been kind of obsessed with this image of the tragic mulatto? And the tragic mulatto is kind of character that comes up in a lot of literature, particularly in the late 19th century and the kind of turn of the century. And it actually really runs through the 20th century. I mean, it's a character that we could probably still see some examples of today. The idea of it is that it's a person who is mixed race and who is sort of they can't find a place for themselves. They're sort of lost because they can't fit into the white world, but then they're not really accepted in the Black world either, and that this ends up causing them tremendous psychological pain and damage. And I really made a very conscious effort to not engage with that concept that much. I mean, I certainly had to reference it because that is what people are very familiar with, particularly when you're talking about passing and we're talking about the literature of passing. But I wanted to show that the people that I'm looking at are fully formed people and that they're making decisions often for their own survival. and that the reasons why they're choosing to pass are not always what people assume, which would be, that they're race traitors or, they're betraying the race or something like that, but rather that in some cases this was the only way that they were able to survive, or this was the only way that they were able to kind of have the privileges or have the accomplishments or the successes that they had earned. So in the case of the family that I showed last, the father had actually gone to the University of Chicago's medical school, and he could not find a job. No one would hire him. And then supposedly a white doctor says to him, why don't you just pass? Why don't you just not tell anybody what your race is and see what happens? So he decides to do that because at the time his wife is pregnant and he's concerned that he's not going to be able to take care of his family. And there's this really stark juxtaposition of all of these opportunities that he has once he's passing as white compared to having no opportunities when he's living as a black man. So I think, to answer your question, part of the reason why there's so much fixation on it is that I think we're very uncomfortable, and particularly in the late 19th century, early 20th century, people were very uncomfortable with the idea of a mixed race person. And I think we could certainly debate and discuss whether there still is some kind of discomfort in the sense that we're much more comfortable when we can say you're one thing or you're the other. You fit into this box or you fit into that box. And once we start talking about fluidity, once we start talking about the ways that people actually live their lives and the kind of complexity of identity, and particularly the complexity of racial identity, I think people get very uncomfortable. So I think the idea of the tragic mulatto made sense to an audience that wanted a kind of melodramatic figure. I mean, this fit in with the kind of sentimental literature that people were reading at the time. And it also just allowed people to sort of say, like, yeah, we don't really know what to do with this in-between person, so we're just going to call them tragic and let it go, and focus more on these characters where it's clearer, we know who they are, and we don't have to kind of deal with the deeper complexities there.
We'll take our last question down here.
Fascinating. Thank you so very much. My question builds on what you were just talking about, and that is the fact with multiracial marriages happening so much, and it's so much more visceral. You can see it so much more today. What does that mean for the future of identity?
Yeah, great question. My hope would be that we will begin to really look at and address and embrace the complexity of identity. And I think that's the direction that our society is moving in. That slowly, yes, exactly. Because I think that we still do live in a society that is more comfortable with sort of these definitions. This audience is fantastic. It's just I don't even have to really answer questions. I should just give my mic to other people in the audience. But exactly, we want order, we want definitions, we want sort of clear-cut categories, and I think that we're finally getting to the point where we're realizing that no one's identity is clear-cut. That this isn't even just an issue about race or ethnicity, but this is an issue that spans, that goes all across the board, that we all have different identities, that we all skate across different identities at different times. That when we're in one situation, we are identified in one way, and when we're in another situation, we might identify in another way. I like to pretend that I'm like from the city when I'm really from like the suburbs, or there's like when it sort of works in my favor. There's different identities that we all sort of inhabit. So I guess I would say that my hope would be that we'll get to the point where we will be more appreciative and more kind of embracing of the complexity of all of our identities. And it's very complicated, because just to make one last point, I think that one of the concerns about mixed race identities, particularly for people who identify as mixed race rather than Black, for example, is that, if you think about certain compensatory programs like affirmative action, that we don't want to kind of dilute those programs by having a sort of shrinking African American population. So there really are real concerns about how people identify, and that there are real governmental connections that are created based on how someone identifies. So I think we have to keep that in mind, but ideally that would start to change as well, so that we could become a society that is more inclusive and more open-minded, and more willing to really try to understand the complexity of identity.
And I think millennials are doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you for such great questions. Thank you.